of the Audit and Governance Committee. We've got this extra title. And could I ask everyone to note the fire safety instruction? There are no planned fire drills tonight, but if the alarm goes off, please use the fire exit through the main doors of the hall or the fire exit in the storeroom adjacent to the stage, which is over to my left. The fire assembly point is on the island in front of the main entrance to the building. Do not delay your evacuation to collect belongings and do not return to the building unless given permission by council staff. I'd also like to remind you to please switch your phones to silent or turn them off. And please note the meeting will be live streamed where the proceedings are capable of repeated viewing. So please ensure your microphone is switched on when speaking and you clearly speak into the microphone. Once finished speaking, can you please switch off your microphone to avoid feedback? And if you're seated in the public area of the chamber, which no one is, it's likely your image will be captured by the recording cameras and your image being part of the broadcast. If members are for any reason not present for the whole debate on an item, you will not be allowed to vote on that item. May I remind members to declare any interests and the nature of the interest at the beginning of an agenda item, and that on declaring a pecuniary interest, you're required to leave the room when that item of business is considered. Now, we'll now move on to item 1, apologies for absence. And I believe, have we received apologies? Well, I know Sarah Jane Page won't be here tonight. I had a phone call from her husband about that. Thank you. Okay. Okay. Any non-members attending? No? And there are no non-members. Item 3 is to receive declarations of interest. Any declarations of interest? No, there are none. Urgent business, item 4, there is no urgent business. Now, members, before we proceed to agenda item 5, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to Miss Janine Hook, who is our newly appointed independent person working with the Audit and Governance Committee. Please I'd like to invite Ms. Hook to introduce herself to members. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Janine Hooks. I've been a civil servant for 39 and a half years. I've just recently retired and I've done audit work for the last 20 years, 18 to 20 years. So I've been appointed to this audit committee. I also I've been appointed to the Chelmsford City Audit Committee as well. So as an independent person, so I'm an independent on both. Hopefully I'll have a bit of experience that I can share with you. Hopefully I'll be a bit of a challenge to you because I know all the audit committees that I've sat on, I've been challenged. So, you know, it's time to get my own back, really. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Janine. Now we can move on to item 5, which is the Internal Audit Annual Report 2023-24. And we'll now consider the report of the Audit and Counter Fraud Manager presenting the Chief Audit's Executive Annual Opinion on the overall adequacy and effectiveness of the Council's framework of governance, risk management and internal control during 23-24. The report begins on page 5.1 of your pack and is for noting. Mr. Porter, do you have anything to add to the report?
I have a few things just to take you through, give you a bit of context to the report, if that's okay. So if I can refer members to page 5.1 of the report itself. So at paragraph 1.3, it says the UK public sector internal audit standards require that the chief audit executive, the fancy name for the head of audit, must give an annual internal audit opinion and provide a report that can be used for the council's annual governance statement. So in coming up with this opinion, we undertake a plan of audit work, which was agreed by members back in March 23. So that enables me to draw on all the work undertaken during the course of the year to provide that annual opinion. So what are the highlights from the work we carried out for 23-24? So if I can refer members to page 5.2 and paragraph 2.2. So this sets out the work we've undertaken during the course of the year. So we have delivered 12 of the 17 planned audits. If you add in the one completed by Brentford Council on our behalf, that makes it 13 audit pieces of work we completed. 10 of those reports resulted in adequate assurance. So this is how we derive our opinion based on those 10 audit reviews we have undertaken. And these are summarised at Appendix 1. Since the last meeting of this committee, we've completed a further 3 reviews. 1 was limited and 2 were adequate in terms of opinion. As at the 5th of June 2024, there are a total of 53 live audit recommendations, of which 39 were overdue. I have attempted to obtain information in terms from managers in terms of progress in relation to those audit recommendations. I haven't had much of a feedback, and where I have had feedback, there's not been much progress made in terms of those recommendations. So in terms of the audit opinion itself, that's provided at paragraph 3. So I can ask members to look at paragraph 3.3. So the Chief Audit Executive is satisfied that sufficient work has been undertaken to draw a reasonable conclusion on the adequacy and effectiveness of the Council's arrangements. Based on the work performed during 2023-24 and other sources of assurance, the Chief Audit Executive is of the opinion that adequate assurance can be taken that the Council's risk management, internal control and governance process in operation during the course of the year generally accord with proper practice and are fundamentally sound, although there's some opportunities for improvement. What I would like to say is that we can't look at everything during the course of the year. So that audit opinion is purely based on the work we've undertaken during the course of the year. We can only give sort of like reasonable assurance. We can't give absolute assurance because we're not able to look at everything. And I don't think Tim could afford for us to look at everything. So that opinion is based purely on the work undertaken during the course of the year. And the actual audits undertaken is provided at Appendix 1. So this gives a flavour of all the work we're undertaken during the course of the year. I'm quite happy to take any questions in relation to my report.
Council, Mrs. Wilson.
Thank you, Chair. May I ask a question to Mike Porter, please?
Yes.
Thank you. Mike, carrying on from what you said about the 39 overdue recommendations, I understand totally where that leaves you, but where do you go? What is your next action to ensure that the majority of those are concluded fairly promptly? Because if they're not concluded, then you have to turn around and say, without being rude to you, how effective are the audits being? Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I send out regular progress reports, and if I don't get any responses, what I tend to do is escalate that to Tim, or indeed the new Deputy Chief Executive, who would be Paul Birkinshaw, to basically escalate that up to managers and ask for a response. I mean, you're right in what you say. If people are not actioning audit recommendations, that leaves the control framework weak. So we're making recommendations to make improvements to the control environment. So where those recommendations are not being implemented, that leaves issues and concerns for internal audit. So it is a significant matter if recommendations do not get implemented. The only course of action we have is essentially referring that to senior management and saying, this is not good enough, something needs to happen. And then there'd be an expectation on senior management to have a quiet word with the managers and say to them, look, we need those recommendations implemented. So it's an escalation process. We can also highlight that to members like we have done today in terms of actually your role as members is to support the work of internal audit. So we would look for you to support and for you to, again, on our behalf, speak to senior management and go, look, we've heard from the internal auditor in terms of recommendations, this is not good enough. We want to see some prompt action taken here. I hope that helps.
Yes, carry on.
Thank you. Mike, can I just ask, when you go back to seek assurance and evidence that these overdue recommendations are implemented and make the point that they are overdue. Do you put timescales on them? Thank you.
We give them sort of 2 or 3 weeks to sort the situation out, and each individual recommendation itself has got a date for implementation. But we do like to say we want to see some action taken over the next 3 or 4 weeks. But again, we're not getting, there's not much traction. We still don't get comments back. It's an ongoing dialogue with senior managers. We do try and get recommendations implemented, but as you're right, it falls down to management to take action. I as a head of audit, I can't force managers to implement audit recommendations. And there might be pertinent reasons, because we do get managers coming to us and asking, can you move the dates? Because there may be real, appropriate reasons why they can't meet the timescales set. But in setting the dates in the first place, we ask them to set reasonable timescales. There's no point setting a date that you know you can't consciously meet. So we'd expect them to set reasonable timescales. And when they're not implementing them, then yes, we do ask for updates in terms of where they're at.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Porter. One thing I would ask, obviously, the focus would tend to be on issues that are above the grade, or rather below the grade of adequate. So if we get down to limited, or so we take steps there. I mean, there are a couple of risk issues which we've used a looser date on. And if you want to explain what that is, it's just to cover that. Or are you going to, okay, sorry.
Yes, there's ways in which we would manage risk and exercise internal control that go beyond just internal audit. But that's not to say that Mike's recommendations and reports aren't very important. And as he's alluded to, each audit assignment is concluded with a draft report, which is run past management, and management provide a response, any wrinkles are ironed out before it appears before the committee. And management own the recommendations and the timetable of delivery of those recommendations. So there's no reason to think that the recommendations won't be implemented in accordance with that timetable that they themselves have signed up to. This is very similar to a discussion that we actually had at Brentwood's audit committee last year. And Brentwood concluded they wanted to make a recommendation to tighten up enforcement of acting on recommendations from internal audit reports, which I can maybe bring to the next committee, but it refers to things like requiring the relevant director to attend the meeting if audit recommendations aren't implemented within a reasonable period after. I think what was agreed was people were allowed twice to defer the date of implementation, but then if they did it again, then they had to turn up to committee and explain themselves. So that type of arrangement might be something that this committee might want to provide, which adds to Mike's ability to cajole people to complete the recommendations. It also adds more power to my elbow at corporate leadership team to say, come on guys, you need to take these seriously and implement them. Now, there are often very good reasons why recommendations aren't implemented. Sometimes they're not relevant anymore. Sometimes there's big staff turnover. Sometimes events change and it's not, it means to be implemented in a different way. But all of that can be explained in terms of reasons why a recommendation may not longer be relevant or back to this committee. So I have sympathies with you, Councillor Wilson, as to what's inherent in the sentiments behind your question.
Thanks very much, Tim. Councillor Booth?
Yes, just like to come to the audit plan on 5.6, just going for those things that are below adequate, as we've stated, like the Chair stated. So if we could go to corporate risk 1, we failed to deliver the objectives of the Council's business plan in terms of measurable outcomes. And that seems to be around the fact that that's been deferred because as such time as the one team approach has been agreed. So can I just ask for clarification when we hope that might be agreed, or is that still to be decided?
Thank you, Aaron.
Yeah, I think in total we deferred a total of 3 audit reviews because of ongoing service reviews. It's something that we hope to look at once those service reviews are completed. Although I note from a recent report, a Q4 progress report that went to audit and scrutiny April, there's been a degree of slippage in terms of service reviews, and there's been a sort of rethink in terms of actually the process going forward in terms of service reviews, more of a roadmap approach. But I'm sure Tim can provide more information on that. But it is hoped that basically when both councils determine their approach or the ways of working going forward, we can look at those areas. It's difficult to undertake internal audits when you're trying to review service areas that are not clear on their direction of travel, where they're going, and what procedures and processes they want in place. Because you can do an audit and they'll say to you, well, it's all going to change in 2 or 3 weeks' time. So then we wouldn't look to undertake an audit. There's not much point in doing an audit right now if the process is about to change. So they're being deferred because of ongoing service reviews or a planned process in terms of taking it forward. So we would wait till those processes are complete. But in terms of a timetable and timeline, perhaps Tim could add something to that.
Yeah, thank you, Tim.
Thanks, Chair. Yes, I'm not sure if any of this has actually gone to committee yet, but the idea of service reviews under one team has changed. It's been felt that the top tiers of management were all done. Top 4 tiers of management were effectively all done under one team banner. So they're shared posts, largely, some exceptions like Brentwood's HRA, things like that, but mostly they're shared. And where there were real benefits to be had of developing a shared team, those were prioritised under service reviews and completed under the one team banner. The conclusion now is to draw a line under that approach and adopt a new approach, which is more what's being called transformation. I would describe it as saying, stepping back for those services that haven't been through a review, and even some that already have, are there other ways of delivering the service? Can you adopt a different approach to back office systems, for example, as well as processes? Or look for more radical options such as outsourcing, a number of those other options that you may not have done under the one team service review banner, which was largely about bolting 2 teams together and it becoming one team. So I think there's maybe a more rounded, transformative approach to future reviews of services, which is the equivalent of the old one team reviews. Now, that's not to say that Mike won't still struggle at times if he wants to engage on an audit and people are saying, we're going through a review. But that will always be the case. There will always be change going on, and we just have to accommodate that as best we can. I just don't expect there to be the same level of change, certainly among senior managers, as there has been, because we've dealt with those top tiers of management already.
Right, Councillor.
So, just for clarity then, there's no timeline given to when, as members, we would hear when the approach has been agreed, or is it continually changing and it's in a circular approach?
One of the difficulties with this is the way in which organisations decide to organise their services is, strictly speaking, under the head of paid services remit to decide how he wants to do that. But naturally enough, there are times where if it's changing the configuration and nature or quantum of that service, then members are going to be interested. And if that type of change, that type of transformative change were to be proposed, that would come before members. But it won't necessarily follow that if a service is restructuring and it's not costing more money and it's not making any significant savings and there's no redundancies, members may never hear about it. We just do that as officers. As long as we still deliver the service you expect, that's all you need to know. So I think there is a line here between officer responsibilities and member responsibilities. But having said that, the service reviews have ended in their previous form. We are now, I, for example, as one of the directors, have been asked to produce the transformation plan for finance and the transformation plan for revenues and benefits. And my revenues and benefits one, for example, is saying, well, Rochford has a in-house revenues and benefits team, and Brentwood uses Basildon for revenue benefits. We need to do a review of that. But before we do that, they need to use one system because the system's critical for revs and bens. That's at least 2 years away. So it's probably about 3 years. So I'll develop a plan over the next 3 years to do that. So that's a transformation plan, as an example. Well, I'm not going to be bringing that before any members because it's so distant and there won't be consequences for years to come. So I think that the nature of the beast has changed a little bit from the headline strategic partnership of let's have one chief executive, let's have one set of strategic directors and corporate managers. That was the sort of the big bang, low-hanging fruit savings to be had from one team. That's all happened and that's over. So the next stage is more around individual services deciding what's best for that service as a way forward. That may come before members as a specific transformation piece of work project, but that doesn't necessarily follow. I don't know what the chief exec's got planned to report corporately on this. I know he's talking to the leaders, but I'm not sure it's manifested in terms of a committee report as yet.
Thank you, Tim. It's always good to be told what I need to know. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Councillor Wootton.
Thank you, Chairman. Audit is a pretty strange animal in the sense that we tend to look at the 20% that's not going quite so well versus the 80% in most organisations that's going pretty well. But I think along with Councillor Vilma Wilson, we have to be careful of all our Wilsons around the table, Councillor Vilma Wilson, we must have honed in, a number of us have honed in on the last bullet point of 2.2. And certainly, I think 74% being overdue is not acceptable. And I do not believe that it is good enough for us to leave this room tonight with a recommendation just noted, because actually what noted means is we've noted it, we walk away and nothing changes. And I think if this committee is to have teeth, we need to be feeding back our concerns through senior management. So I'm not quite sure how that's going to get documented because I'm quite happy with the noted recommendation, but I think there's additional things to add to it. So that's the first point, but I'm very concerned at overdue because that could be for a number of reasons. It could be because there's stress in the organisation. It could be because people just put it in the too difficult box to handle, so we put that off until tomorrow. But there's underlying reasons, and for me that's a real concern that something which is a regulatory requirement, 74% are overdue, and it's demonstrating, to put it bluntly, a lack of management control. A strong statement. The other thing, Chairman, if I may, is turned to page 5.13, the last but one paragraph, and I think that does need noting. I don't think there's anything that can be added tonight because it's a consequence of the budgetary process, but to know that we are knowingly heading for a budget gap, I think in 24-25, we ought to be talking about how that is going to be addressed. It's not good enough for it to wait until February, March time when we look at the annual budget and fingers crossed approach. I think there should be a clear plan on the part of the administration to see how it is going to address a projected budget gap. That's why this is an excellent bit of information. Not sure it's anything the audit committee can do, but I just highlight it as something that in good governance we should be looking at, and I'm sure you are. Thank you, Chairman.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Wootton. Actually raised a good point in that it would be useful if the committee got a report other than this report on where we're heading or a projection of that. Because we could have that either in an interim or we can have it for the next meeting, but probably the next meeting some time away though. So I can ask Tim just an update in that area. We're all aware of what the situation is, but you know what the projection is for actually doing something about it. That's it. Pardon?
Do you want to
And then, well, yeah, an out of committee report. That's what
Just in respect of Councillor Wotton's comments about the paragraph related to the medium-term financial strategy budget gaps, they are what were lifted from the council meeting, and the council report discussed those and highlighted why, although it's unfortunate that there is still a gap showing in a future year or future years, that's a long way off, and there's a huge amount of uncertainty of so many variables, not least a general election that we now know about that we didn't know about when the budget was approved, and as well as many, many other macroeconomic and local issues, which was why with the level of uncertainty behind the projections, I advised as the Section 151 officer that I was comfortable with a medium-term financial strategy that didn't show a gap until year 4 of the 5-year MTFS, and other than £4,000. I think if there's an update, it will be in the next MTFS that goes to council. Will probably go to the Strategy, Finance and Policy Committee as well before that. In addition to that, I will be writing a paper on financial planning, which I've promised the Chief Executive, which is intended to set out a timetable for the big decisions like fees and charges, and also any growth and savings, as well as budget consultation, those types of matters that relate to the 25-26 budget, as well, which will provide an update on last year's outturn position, as well as this year's latest budget monitoring position. So just take a snapshot of a sort of update of the overall financial position. I'd expect that to be available to members, and it's something that once it's produced, I could share with members of this committee for information, if that would be of use, rather than it being a report to this committee, because I'm not sure it's within the remit of this committee to do anything with it in any case.
Thanks very much. So we will get an update in that form. Yeah, that's good. And I'll now like to call on Janine, our independent person. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, it's going back to the recommendations, basically. I suppose it's a question of the escalation process, and do you think that the senior management have got sort of a full understanding of what the recommendations are there for, and do you think that they understand the sufficient gravitas of those recommendations? So actually, it is interesting, it is important to implement those recommendations.
Thank you. Tim?
Yeah, so let's pick up that point by Janine Hoax and also Councillor Wotton, originally raised by Councillor Mrs Wilson. I found the recommendation that Brentwood Audit and Scrutiny Committee at the time approved because it went through a similar process. And I offer it to you as something that you could even take on board tonight if the committee was so minded, but or wording to such effect. And Mike might have a view on this as well, in terms of the processes might not be exactly the same that are followed between the two councils on audit recommendations. But what it says is to approve an escalation process for the non-completion of audit recommendations. The escalation process will require responsible officers for recommendations that have surpassed 2 implementation dates to attend the audit committee to provide an update on progress and an explanation of not implementing the recommendation by the agreed dates. So what that's saying is, if the date comes up and it's not been done, then management say, okay, it'll be that date. And then if they do that again, they say it'll be that date. Third strike, they're out. And basically, if they don't hit that second date, they then have to turn up at committee. Would that tie in with the sort of process that you would typically follow, Mike, in terms of following up on recommendations?
Due to the limitations of this system we record recommendations on, it's pretty quite difficult to track dates changing, and then miss 2 dates. That's if they come back to me in the first place with a revised date. So given the lack of dialogue to date, getting a revised date out of people might be difficult, but I mean, we can track progress in terms of a latest note or update in terms of management, where they are providing latest updates in terms of where they're at, to give a flavour. Actually, is the recommendation progressing? I mean, yeah, there's probably some sort of mechanism to adopt the two-strike approach. If they missed a date once, okay, it's fine. If they miss another date, and then they need to come. So there's probably some way of actually using the system we currently use to utilise to do that.
Right, thank you. Councillor Mrs Wilson.
Hello, Chair. Thank you. I'm fully aware that this report is for noting, and if appropriate, and please tell me if it's not, I would actually like to put forward a motion to repeat what Tim Willis has just said, but with a small amendment to that. That actually, if you give someone the opportunity to miss 2 dates before they attend, then they would have no incentive to hit the first date, which just gives Mike even more work. So if we were to implement that, I would like that if they miss the first date, then to attend our committee to explain why. Thank you.
Right, thank you. Right. Councillor Marriott.
I'm Chairman. I'm thinking very much along the same lines as Councillor Vilma Wilson here. What I was thinking, to make it just a tad more specific, is to put a date past the date, if that makes sense. So if you've gone, this is for the committee to decide whether it be 3 months or 6 months, for example. So Councillor Wilson's amendment with a date. So if you go past it by, say, 3 months, then it gets called in, or if members would prefer 6 months, so it's. I agree with Councillor Wilson, but I'd like to put a date past the date as a calling point.
Sorry, can I just add something? If you look at the Appendix 5, you can see 2 dates already in terms of the original date set, so you can actually gauge how old the recommendation is. So it might be something that, you look at the 2 dates and call in any recommendations that's currently over 6 months old or a year old, and say, these are the ones I want to focus in on. From those 2 dates, you can see that, that some of these recommendations are very old. So you can also obviously sort the recommendations by priority. So depending on what members want to set in terms of a review process, you could say, I'm not really interested in low priority recommendations, but any senior management who's got overdue, critical, major recommendations, these people need to come in and explain what they're doing to address major priority recommendations, because these are the ones that should be implemented within a timescale of about 3 months. Low priority, we can give a bit of leeway, but when you're talking about critical or major priority recommendations, we want to see those implemented immediately. So I'm not sure. We can. I'm quite happy to take on board what.
Right, thank you. Councillor Wood.
Thank you, Chairman. I think we're in danger with respect to making a bit heavy weather here. We've got 2 issues. One is the fact that there is 74% of these that are overdue, and I think a clear line, and I'm arbitrarily suggesting it matters not the level of importance on those 74%. They're overdue. And I would suggest that we expect them to be brought up to speed by the end of August, which is actually 2 months. And I would have thought that's a reasonable time frame to pull it back. So it doesn't really matter whether it's severe or minor, they're overdue, and they should have been done by now. Then I think it comes back to Councillor Vilma Wilson's recommendation, and I would agree with modifications, that from an ongoing point of view, there is some sanction if they go overdue again. So I think there's 2 quite distinct issues here. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Councillor Booth.
Yes, interesting, Councillor Watson, you said ongoing, because I was going to raise the point that we've got here on corporate risk 13. And I think there's another one as well. Yeah, just turning over the page, so 5.9, the bottom of 5.8, it's actually determined as ongoing. So I wonder how we measure something that's ongoing. I always get slightly nervous when I see ongoing in any kind of action plan or risk assessment. Is it just a convenient thing to cut and paste? There's no conclusion to it. There's no accountability to it. So my only caveat with what's been mentioned so far, and I do agree with all those that have just spoken before me, is how do we enact anything that might be ongoing?
Perhaps in the table, we should put the date that it started to be worked on, and then we will know how long it's been going on for.
I'm willing to give way to the experience and expertise of the chair.
Thank you, Councillor Booth. Yeah, I think that's probably a good idea. We could, once we've got an alignment, so we have to give them a chance to get aligned, as Councillor Wootton says, and then we've got a sort of starting point. And then, as we progress on, we can get ourselves perhaps more comfortable with the working arrangements of it, practicalities, as it were. And it keeps the committee informed. So if something's going on for a long time, there might be a very good reason for that. But we will know what that is, because that will be explained. At the moment, we don't, because it's just somewhere in a table. Thank you.
Sorry, can I just pick up on, if we're looking at 5.9, the ongoing relates to account fraud work. So basically, all we're saying here is that we continue to monitor fraud arrangements. We're not actually undertaking an audit of fraud. This is just myself monitoring account fraud arrangements across the organisation and reporting those in the report in terms of progress made, savings returned. So ongoing, there's no end date. It's all it's saying is we continue to monitor fraud throughout the life cycle of the organisation. It's not saying we're doing an audit. So where you see complete, they're in relation to specific pieces of work, like an audit review. So this one where it says ongoing, it talks about counter fraud work. This is just ongoing fraud work. There's no end date to it, but we give you progress reports.
Okay, yeah, as long as we understand that, that's good. Councillor Booth, we'll have to move on after this one.
Okay, yes, well, thank you for that reassurance, and perhaps that could just be clarified in some notes somewhere next to the ongoing.
Yeah, certainly.
Right, thanks very much. Now, at the moment, we can note the report, but we're also going to note the comments, I think. Yeah. Was there another one? Oh, Vilma, sorry. Councillor Wilson, Mrs. Wilson.
Chair, thank you very much for your patience with me. Is it possible for me to put forward a motion so that the matter that we have just discussed is recorded formally and is actioned?
What's your view on that, Tim?
I'm happy for you to have a go at it, but it sounded like there were a number of slightly different views around the committee. But if members want to do that, then obviously it's within your right to draw up a recommendation. I could offer an alternative, which is I bring back to the next committee a proposal which I will have formulated in draft with the chair and vice chair in an attempt to come up with something that you can agree on the night at the next meeting that addresses this escalation issue. But if you think you may have captured the essence of what's needed, then I'm very happy with that.
Through the chair, thank you, Tim. I'm going to have a go, and I would like input from committee members because I think I will need it. So, okay, I'd like to put forward a motion, carrying on from what Tim quoted earlier, that basically, and I'm referring mainly to Appendix 5, but not exclusively to Appendix 5, so my motion would be for any outstanding recommendations to be actioned by the timescale given by the audit officer. If for whatever reason these recommendations on the audit are not completed, then, and this is why I'm going to need the committee to add in, because I firmly feel that if the first time scale is missed, then the officer attend audit committee to explain why, in an attempt for the committee to be brought up to date with the reasons as to why the audit recommendations are not being carried out. I sincerely hope someone has written that down. Happy to accept any amendment to what I've just said. Thank you.
I think we'd have to get that typed up, make sure we've got it right. Councillor Wootton.
I think that's absolutely splendid. But what I'm actually going to suggest is that the sentiment of that, we take the sentiment of that up with what Tim was suggesting. I think we've made a very clear message tonight, and rather than make recommendations on the hoof, we just have time to digest your words in the context. I think everyone knows what we're trying to say. And for example, I might be a bit picky, but I think it's important that rather than the officer, it's actually the responsible director. So I'm just a little concerned that we agree something that sounds very sensible tonight, but we actually just reflect and think about the responsible director coming, because they should actually have control on their business. So I'm totally agreeing, but I'm a bit reluctant to agree to a recommendation on the hoof.
I think Tim has already passed the comment that he can work on.
Yes, I
something
can.
to bring back to this
I'm
committee.
I'm happy to do that. In terms of the responsible officer, it might need to say responsible officer because sometimes a corporate manager is responsible for that service. There are certain circumstances where that would be the case, rather than naming the director. Having this time to finalise something is useful as well, because although we're here to serve as officers, I need to take this away to my corporate leadership team colleagues, all of them, to get them to buy into this. And I'm absolutely sure they will, because they've already done it for Brentwood. Basically, it's the same sort of thing. We've already got some processes and expectations in place. So this is, I think, would be absolutely in keeping with what they would expect now to hear from me from this committee. But it will just enable me to complete that loop, this extra bit of time, and finalise the wording so that we are confident that not just that this committee can agree something you all agreed on the wording at the next meeting, but you can be reassured that all of the senior managers have buy-in to that exact recommendation, because they'll have been reminded of Mike's report and the 74% of missed recommendations, and they'll know that there's an expectation, not just from you, but from me and Jonathan and the monitoring officer, that they'll take these recommendations more seriously in future.
Thanks very much. So we can actually then say that we can note this report, but we have got concerns, and that we're requesting a report back to the way ahead to actually formulate a better arrangement, so it's more understandable and transparent, so we know where we're at.
Yeah. It'll come. Well, I was just saying to Mike that he and I will work on it, and it'll be included in the next internal audit update report.
Right, thanks very much. And well, members, will that be noted then? Right, that's noted. Well, moving on, item 6 are the annual governance statements. We'll now consider a report of the Interim Director Resources presenting the annual governance statement for 22-24 and 2023-24. The report begins on page 6.1. And Mr. Willis, do you have anything to add to the report?
Thank you, Chair. This is a covering report for 2 annual governance statements, or AGSs, for the years 22-23 and 23-24. And the draft AGSs are attached as appendices. The AGS is a document that assesses the Council's governance. It highlights any areas of planned work for the forthcoming year, and also looks back on achievements in the previous year. These documents are late to be produced. They will be published as part of the 22-3 accounts and the 23-4 accounts. Although covering 2 years, this report, the 22-23 AGS is rather historic. The objectives were set in advance of 22-3. The actions took place during 22-3, and we're reporting on that historically. But for 23-4, that's more relevant, the AGS for 23-4, because it includes our plans to improve governance during this year, 24-25. We're also proposing a change to past practice, in that we want to enhance the importance of governance by reporting at the half-year point on progress towards achieving the planned actions, which I know Paul Birkinshaw, the new monitoring officer, was keen to include, to try and reinforce the importance of report, not just delivering on the actions we say we're going to deliver on, but reporting to demonstrate that we are delivering on those actions halfway through the year as well as after the year has ended. I'm happy to answer any questions, Chair.
Sorry, members, have you got any questions? Councillor Wootton.
Thank you, Chairman. On page 6.1, number 2, my sympathies really are with the finance team, because to keep going back year on year and finding the data to satisfy questions that auditors will be asking must be so frustrating. And it is not Rochford District Council's fault that centrally appointed auditors are failing to carry out the task. So in line with my previous thoughts on this subject, I believe that a letter should go from the Chief Executive and the leader to whatever they call themselves these days, the Audit Commission or whatever, and certainly early next week to whoever is the MP, because this is through a tendering process with central government that this process has failed. And for us to just be sitting here and say, oh, well, okay, the 21-22 accounts are still being audited, 3-4 years on, isn't good enough. So I don't think we should just sit back. I think the report is absolutely fine and no problem with that. So I would like to see us put pressure on the appointed bodies to make sure that we don't just sort of accept it. I think we should be protesting, because I think it's absolutely disgraceful. It is a failure of the tendering process and the professional arena of auditors that's going wrong. Because if there was something wrong within a council, it would take a long while. Let's face it. I believe that Rochford District Council is in a very good place financially in its management, its audit, its regulatory processes. I don't think for one moment we fall into that category, but external audit is important and it's devaluing the process. The other thing that I would just like to take you to is page 6.22, which was the governance areas for 23-24. And it's an absolute delight to have realised that we've now recruited our independent person. So that was covered earlier because that was in my pink highlighter. So that's nice. But I don't know whether anyone wishes to comment on those other principles and where we are in some of those. I think it would be helpful to understand some of those that are listed down under the principle A, D, E, G, where G is done. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Wood. Any comments, Tim, on the principles? You've got to find it as well.
Yeah, the 622 is the 22-3 AGS, referring
24, yeah.
referring to the actions that are planned in 23-4. Is that? Sorry, I'm just catching up on. I'm not sure if the appendices are the wrong way round, are they?
Yeah, it's the principle.
622. So 622 is at the right near the end of the annual governance statement for 22-23, because it sets out the forward-looking objectives for 23-4. So the last one being independent person be recruited during 23-4. If you then go further down to page 637, you'll see the action from that plan, because the 23-4 AGS is looking back at 23-4 at the actions that were delivered during 23-4 in respect of the targets set in the 22-3 AGS. It's very confusing, and I've spent hours explaining this to all my colleagues to try and get them to populate it, but it's really confusing. But we do it every April, and so April we do the backward look and the forward look for that year. And so independent person was identified in April 23 as something that we wanted to do during 23-4. And in April 24, which should be now, we've looked back and we said, well, we did that. We've successfully recruited. What the ones that we haven't delivered on yet are on 6.38 and 6.39. They're the new ones that we have set ourselves to deliver for 24-5. And I probably should have explained that a bit clearer in my introduction.
Yeah, thanks very much. And in fact, our debate around the previous issue is about the ownership and governance, because when you look at the way we're going ahead, which is what this committee is supposed to do, and I was quite pleased actually that it was taking that form, and I would thank all the members for that. And it also gives us a view that we would hope would bring on an improvement in the following year, because we will have these changes and we'll have this transparency. And it's all about good practice and taking ownership. And if somebody has to come in front of the committee, for example, it shows that they own it and they get asked about it if something doesn't happen. So this is, as you say, a clear way to put this once you've unravelled it all and sorted it out, because unfortunately we've seen the one from the year before and then we've got this one. And then we're working on the next one, but it's an ongoing narrative, and the committee can get the right information and the way you want it, and it's questioned that way. And also we'll highlight where problems where, owing to staffing shortages or other issues, where we can't get forward somewhere, at least we have an appreciation of that, rather than just wonder why a box has got some information in it. So thanks for that, Tim, and I'd like to thank the members as well, because particularly Councillor Wooten, he's been around. Thank you, and Councillor Wilson and Booth. Thank you. Oh yes, Councillor Mr. Wilson. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. Councillor Wotton, did you want that to be a recommendation about flagging up from the Chief Executive and the leader to the Minister responsible for the audit, external audit?
Thank you, Councillor Wilson, for coming back on that point. I believe that it does no harm for us to be doing that. It's a letter that I sent at the time I was leader. I think I sent 2 or 3 of them actually. Nothing happened, but at least, we can say we're on the case and we're making the point. If we just accept it and note it, and I think in time to come, if there were to be an issue, we could turn around and say year on year on year, the leader and the chief executive express their concern at the elapse of time at getting audits completed, even though it's a little bit of a tick the box exercise. The answer is yes, please. Yeah, I'd make a recommendation that we do send a letter to, we request the chief exec and the leader to send a letter to the appropriate body.
Yeah, thank you. So if we can get that.
Could I just
draft up and
give a bit of advice?
Mr. Willis wants to come back. Okay.
Before I tell the chief exec what he's going to do tomorrow, what I would say is the reason why we're now I am unable to tell you what's going to happen as regards external audit across the country, not just at Rochford, is because the plan was the minister had resolved this issue finally via the regulatory bodies and agreed that there would be a backstop date. So they were saying everything earlier than 23-4 accounts, so 22-3 accounts earlier, they're all going to be done by September 24. That's it. They're going to be done. They have to be done. In law, they've got to be done. Don't care how, they're going to be done. And what EY told us, our external auditors, was, okay, we'll finish off 21-2 audit because we've done a lot of that already, the audit of the 21-2 accounts. The 22-3, we're not even going to look at it really. We're barely even light touch. We will disclaim the 22-3 accounts, which people like me don't like, because it's like normally an auditor disclaims if they've not been let through the door of the council offices. So, but in these circumstances, it was different because it was happening all over the country. So they were going to disclaim the 22 accounts, so they'd hit the September deadline. And then the 23-4 accounts could be audited a bit more normal way. Now, the general election was called, and it didn't enable the parliamentary time to enact that. So now we don't know what's happening. So all I would suggest is, we don't know who the minister's going to be from the day after tomorrow. Well, probably now. So it's hard to be able to do that. So I suggest perhaps we just wait a short while to see whether this issue that didn't get caught in a wash-up of all the legislation from the old government is addressed early in the new government. Then at least we can see what that future looks like, and we can comment on that as a statement, rather than one that we would want to do right now. And also, leader to minister, I take advice on this, but we are impaired at the moment, so it might be something we shouldn't be recommending.
Councillor Leary.
Thank you, Chair. Given the election's only a few days away, the general election, would it not make more sense to try and raise this to the relevant minister as soon as possible, so that it's on their desk to be dealt with? They're going to have a load of things to deal with. Maybe we need to make some noise about this early, so that it gets dealt with early. Thank you, Chair.
Right, thank you. Tim, have you got any view on that?
I'm not an expert on the pre-election period and the law, but I would always err on the side of caution and not advise any committee during the pre-election period to make any recommendations that remotely resembled any political statements, like writing to ministers. But Matt might be able to offer clear advice on that.
Sorry. Yes, sorry.
Thank you, Chairman. I share the same risk approach as Tim. What I would suggest, though, is that we've heard the discussion here. I know Tim has heard it as well. This might be something that you might want to come back to the next meeting of this committee, along with the other items that Tim has already committed to. That might allow the opportunity for potentially new government to settle in, new minister to be in post. Undoubtedly, this issue is going to continue to be raised by local authorities all up and down the country in this period anyway. And then if there is still nothing at that point, no firm commitment from government, then that next committee meeting is the ideal springboard to say, we've raised this continually. Councillor Wootton's raised it as leader previously as well. We've expressed our issues right before the election. We held fire whilst the election was taking place, and now we do want to formally express our issues with the government from both leader and chief executive, if they'll acquiesce. That would be my recommendation, but welcome the committee's views.
Councillor Wood.
Listening to that recommendation, how could we possibly disagree with wise guidance? So instead, I would suggest that we actually write to the LGA, Local Government Association, who are flooded with similar points. But I just think we need to add weight. So I would suggest there needs to be a letter on file from good old Rochford District Council, because I don't think necessarily it'll come to the top of anyone's pile, but it's the number of authorities that are in exactly the same position. So I think there ought to be a letter somewhere. Local Government Association is probably as good as anywhere.
Yeah, thank you for your suggestion. One thing I did ask Mr. Willis was, we could make these issues an agenda item for the next committee meeting, so it doesn't get missed off. So it's actually on there. And then we will have an update, and we'll have some sort of direction then, because by that time, whoever's in office will be possibly giving us some direction. So that could be done, and then that covers our concerns.
We would hopefully be picking this up, because the last time our external auditors communicated with me, which is some months ago, they indicated they would conclude their audit of the 21-2 accounts in time for our September audit committee cycle. So the next meeting of this committee should be receiving the external auditors' audit results report its final audit and the final set of accounts. And that would be a natural time to pick up this issue of external audit generally. And it will be a natural time if that doesn't happen, because I and we have an expectation that will happen, as to receive a report as to why that hasn't happened.
All members, are you happy with that? Because that will come back to this committee. The other thing which will be coming back is that on the annual governance statement issue, in item 6, the 6 monthly review is October, November, so that will follow the next committee meeting, because it gets reviewed in April as well, doesn't it? So that will also give us an update on where we are with regard to the 24-25 report by that time. So we've got some means of looking forward to that and the direction that's going in. Anyway, thank you. Well, the recommendations are to note the contents of the report. Are they noted? Okay, right. And recommendation 2 is to agree that a half-yearly update on actions against the current annual governance statement be reported to the committee, which is going to be that 6 monthly report plus, anything else we need to know in the meanwhile, anything that's emerged. So is that agreed?
You've got to move it.
Huh?
You've got to move it.
Oh, it's a move. Oh, sorry, I missed that one. Yeah, sorry. We have to put a motion forward for that, to agree the half-yearly update and the current on actions against the current annual governance statement be reported to the committee. So I can propose it. Councillor Mrs. Wilson is going to second it. Can we vote with a show of hands, please? That looks unanimous. Thank you. So nobody against and nobody abstaining. Right, moving on to item 7, which is the risk management update. We now consider the report of the Interim Director of Resources updating the committee on the status of the Council's 24-25 Strategic Risk Register. The report begins on page 7.1 and is for noting. Mr. Willis, have you anything to add to the report?
Thank you, Chair. This report sets out the latest assessments by the corporate leadership team regarding the Council's strategic risks. The last time a report came before this committee was in March. There are 3 very high risks, that of cyber threat and the asset delivery programme partnership fails to bring about the project benefits. That's 2 of them, and they are pre-existing very high risks and have been reported to this committee before. Cyber threat is a risk that is managed on an ongoing basis, and the asset delivery programme partnership involves ongoing work and is subject to commercial confidentiality and negotiation, which is taking time. The third new risk is very high risk, is related to the leisure contract. There are ongoing issues with dilapidations in respect to the current provider, leisure provider, and these will complicate an assessment of investment needs in the leisure buildings. And so the procurement of the new leisure contract, because there would be a certain expectation and assumption about the condition of the primary buildings in relation to that leisure contract between the council and the new contractor. So there could be additional costs to be factored in. There is another new risk, which is not very high, but high, which is in relation to capacity in the finance service. This is given the number of vacancies, the fact that there's a current review and restructuring of the service going on, and the severe recruitment and retention challenges there are in finance in local government. The last check, there's 26 posts across the whole of finance, and there's 10 vacancies. So we're operating at nearly 40% vacancy rate at the moment within the finance service, although some posts are covered by interim, such as myself. And which is why we're doing a review, doing a restructure, and hopefully then we can start filling the posts permanently. But that's a new risk that's been added that you won't have seen before. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Members, have you got any questions? Councillor, Mr. Wilson, sorry.
Thank you, Chair. Through you, Tim, risk 20, which you just described, do we know what the impact will be on, if this risk materialises, what the impact will be on the service to our residents, and what contingency have we got to mitigate this risk?
Thank you, Chair. There's probably more than one risk here, actually. The risk of the current leisure provider and the risk of changing providers at the end of a contract that's been in existence for quite a long time. And the fact that the current provider there is documented evidence available in the public domain that would suggest that they're not in the best of financial health nationally. So those present risks, and we are having difficulties finalising dilapidations in respect of the key council buildings of Clements Hall and Rayleigh Leisure Centre with them, as the report sets out. So the risk of dilapidations not being completed as they should be by the leisure provider is that we will end up forking out the cost of carrying out the works to bring the buildings into a state that enables the new contractor to be able to deliver the service that we have an expectation of them. Or else, the other mitigation on that is we don't do the work, but then the new leisure provider factors it into their management fee and recovers it over the longer term through the management fee, just charges us more every year because the buildings need work. So that's how we deal with the building. The other perhaps extreme risk, which isn't especially addressed here, that it's not the primary focus of this risk, I suppose, is that same one that might exist for any provider of an important service. The leisure provider ceases to exist, it goes into administration, it withdraws its service altogether. And that would be serious if it was Norse and we didn't have a bins collected, just as it would be if it was Fusion and the leisure centre shut. Those things can happen. But we would hope that in constant dialogue, and we are with Fusion, perhaps for reasons that are more transactional than about delivering the service at the moment, the ongoing dialogue and the dialogue we're having with other councils whose provider is Fusion enables us to keep a weather eye on the current state of Fusion, and they are looking to restructure their finances and find ways to overcome their current difficulties, which does suggest that we're not about to suffer what could be perhaps the worst possible manifestation of a risk of having no leisure provider and having to shut the leisure centres. I have no reason to think that is a risk that we need to start mitigating in the form of, say, contracting with another party for emergency cover, for example, which would be an extreme measure and be very expensive. Any more than we do that with any other of our frontline services at the moment of providers. But I will, as this is a new risk, I will take this away and speak to Phoebe Barnes, who's, even though it's leisure, as a leisure service, it's not within her remit, but because it's buildings related, it is. She's been taking the lead on it. I'll take this back to her and make these points that you've raised, Councillor Wilson, and ask her to contact you and copy in the rest of the committee to elaborate on what I've been able to say, because obviously it's not a service that I run firsthand.
Thank you, Tim.
Councillor Booth.
Yeah, just in the knowledge, there's no such thing as a silly question. That's the shield I'm putting up at the moment. So I'd just like to, I'd just like to know that 7 out of the 20 risk areas have not got a status measure or any further actions. Is that because they're ongoing? They've already been achieved? So could I just ask that question? Tim's smiling, so I'm thinking it might be a silly question. Off we go.
It's absolutely not a silly question, Councillor Booth. It's a question that I feared. The answer is the relevant risk owner didn't update the risk register in time for the publication of this agenda. And I know that's not an answer that I'd want to give, but that's it.
Well, thank you for your honesty, Tim. So I think we probably, as a committee, need to determine a way forward from your previous statement.
And just to help the committee, I've spoken to Paul Birkinshaw, who's a breath of fresh air since he arrived, because he takes governance very seriously. And he's exercised by this very issue. He's only been here a few weeks, and by the time he spotted this, and I raised it with him, he'd been spending a lot of time on the annual governance statements, actually, when he first came in, and helped me with those, because it's really a monitoring officer and Section 151 officer type role, the AGS is. But he did look at the risk register. Unfortunately for Rochford, because the risk registers are tend to be done at the same time for both councils, because it's the same officers that have sometimes overlapping risks. The Brentwood's one isn't until the 30th of July, whereas this meeting is 2nd of July, quite a bit earlier. And it meant that the rhythm was slightly askew. And it did mean that even though they should all have been completed, some of them weren't, despite reminders. And he's ensuring that they are in time for Brentwood's. Not that that gives you any solace whatsoever, because this is Rochford. But in addition to that, what he said is that he wants, we have a statutory officers meeting, which is the head of paid service, myself and the monitoring officer coming together on a regular basis now. And he wants a standing item, which is addressing any risks and any newly arising risks. And in addition to that, we have something called the Corporate Programme Board, which used to deal with lots of one-team issues, but now it's sort of moving on from that. And one of its functions is going to be looking at not just strategic risks, but operational risks on a monthly basis, which I see as a vehicle by which, in addition to corporate leadership team, can be used as a means of highlighting any areas that aren't being actively managed. Because it's one thing for a member of CLT on the long to-do list not to get around to doing this within the deadline for the committee, which none of the critical risks that's true of. It's only the lower rated risks. I'm not saying it's okay, but it's not the biggest crime in the world. But the more serious issue is, well, it might mean that it is a really high risk because it hasn't properly been looked at and it's not being actively managed. The fact, just because a number hasn't been put in a box and some words haven't been put in a box, it doesn't mean it's just stayed the same as the last time you saw it. It might be much higher risk, and which is a point that is recognised at corporate leadership team. So I fully expect this not to happen again. And if it does happen again, then I'd expect you to be recommending that the culprits report to the next committee to explain why they haven't done that. And if I'm able to report that back to corporate leadership team, then that might be a good thing.
Thank you, Tim, for that. I mean, personally, I am quite concerned, particularly around safeguarding children and vulnerable adults. I think that's a heightened concern for any public body to put children first. So therefore, I am incredibly concerned that Risk 2 has no formative information for this committee to consider. I'm sure other members will have other risks they're more concerned about. But it'd be really reassuring that we will know on September the 3rd that we will have this document completed, so we are fully informed as members.
Thank you.
Sorry, one other thing, Chair. The presentation of this risk report has always been problematic because there's quite a lot of information to put on, and it's far easier for the appendix to be landscape in order to fit it all on. So we've rationalised the information that we have put on here even more. So you haven't got the last quarter score and actions. All you've got is this period now, score and actions. So it actually lays bare the fact that there's no information in a number of the boxes because there's fewer boxes to look at. But I would highlight the fact that we have rationalised the information put on for this committee report, but there's far more information available for the risk owners to look at. And we are now reporting this, putting this on our website after these committees every quarter. And the version we put on the website has more detail than you see before you hear. It has the previous quarters going back and all the actions that were meant to be delivered from the past as well. So I just wanted to reassure members that we are taking risk management seriously. It's regrettable that some of the information hasn't been completed for the deadline for this committee. But it's not to say that we as a council aren't taking our strategic risks seriously, including the risk that Councillor Booth highlighted around safeguarding.
Thank you, Tim. Councillor Wootton.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, I also had wondered why there weren't some categories there, and I think Councillor Booth has raised a really good point. And once again, I applaud the Interim Director of Resources, Tim Willis, for his very direct honesty. Why would he be anything other than that? But I think that's very helpful. But what is a concern, for the second time tonight, we are highlighting issues that haven't gone well. And I'm afraid it continues to point to stress or something, or lack of control in the organisation. And that concerns me. You know, we talk about audits here, and the audit of the audit isn't particularly good because the report itself isn't presented. It's not ringing right. I'm sorry. And we look at risk 17. I thought the previous administration had done away with the title, the Asset Delivery Programme. Perhaps it was because they couldn't think of a better title, so they resorted back to Asset Delivery Programme. I personally don't have a problem with it, but I thought Asset Delivery Programme had been abandoned as a title. And then I go to the final column there, and we seem to be now coming up with new words. Due diligence, I think that should be, as opposed to due diligence. So there's a bit of a typo there, but it's a lovely word. It's absolutely splendid. But if we look at risk 19, there's a deadline there. I appreciate it's only the 2nd of July today, but it talks about a report being completed by the end of June 2024. I think you alluded to this a little earlier. Can we take it that that has been completed? Thank you, Chairman.
That's risk 19. Oh, that's mine. Yes, the consultation ended on the 21st of June, and I had the end of consultation meeting with staff yesterday with the document issued yesterday. So that's complete, and the implementation date is the 15th of July. And there's no redundancies, and everyone's slotted into the new post because there's still 8 posts vacant. So that's all concluded, and hopefully that can help manage that particular risk as we can, now we've got all the posts established and all the permanent staff sorted, we can start making permanent recruitment. Not that that's easy, but it gives us the opportunity to try and recruit all the posts permanently.
Thank you. No other questions. And the recommendation is the committee notes the report, and we're past comment, and we are assured that the next committee meeting there will be an electronic fuller version available with all of the updates. So is this report noted then?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Right, well, moving on is item 8, the capital financing requirement. We'll now consider the report of the Interim Director of Resources outlining the findings of the Council's Treasury Management Advisors link in relation to the capital financing requirement. The report begins on page 8.1 and is for noting. Mr. Willis, have you anything to add to the report?
Yes, thank you, Chair. The members may recall in the past some discussions and questions regarding the origins of the CFR, which is the capital financing requirement, which was always £777,000. I commissioned an expert review, which was Link, who are our Treasury Management Advisors, to try and investigate what this related to, and the report's attached. Our records didn't go back very far. Nobody's employed currently in the finance team or anywhere else at Rochford who has any knowledge of the reasons for this 777,000, and our records don't go back that far. Whereas Link were able to access information through their records because they've been our advisors for a long time. The end result is that the CFR should be not 777, but 789,000. And further, of that 789, we need to set aside 298,000 that's nearly £300,000 in 23-24. And that's a real charge in 23-24 for accumulated MRP. That's minimum revenue provision, which I'll explain in a sec. And to further charge MRP of £15,000 a year for the next 32 years. And if we do that, then we'll have covered off the 789,000. The aim of the exercise was to answer the question, what does the £777,000 relate to if we don't have any external debt? Because we don't. The answer is it's a combination of calculations and mistakes dating back over the last 18 years. And it relates not to external borrowing, but internal borrowing. The definition of internal borrowing is in paragraph 2 of the report. Another way of explaining it is by using an example. It's not exactly the same, but hopefully it enables anyone that isn't an expert in local government treasury management to get a better understanding. So if I wanted to buy a car and I didn't want to borrow money from the bank, I could use funds from my savings account instead. And that is like internal borrowing. But I have some money spare each month. So what I can do is transfer that spare money into my savings account to replenish that savings account back to where it was before I used it to buy my car. And that, putting that money aside each month or each year, whatever, to build it back up is like MRP, minimum revenue provision. It's almost like the principal element of a debt repayment. So the report recommends a catch-up MRP in 23-4 of 298,000, and then a continued contribution each year of 15,000 until the 789,000 is paid off. The report is for noting, as the amounts actually charged to the accounts will be reported and approved by council. It will need to be reported to council as part of the 23-4 outturn, as well as in the 24-5 budget monitoring, because it affects the bottom line that won't have been reflected in the report that was approved by council on this year's budget. Happy to answer any questions.
Just to make sure I've got the right end of the stick
Councillor
here.
Marriott.
If we owe it to ourselves, does that mean that we owe it to reserves?
No. If we have capital spending, this is all about capital. If we have a capital project, if we've got some receipts because we've sold an asset, we can use those receipts to fund it. Or if we have got an external grant, we can use that. Or we can externally borrow to get the money, we can use that. Or we can use our revenue funding, which we sometimes do use. Some of our revenue funding over the years we've put away into a reserve, which is a collection of underspends and such like in previous years. And that reserve has been built up. And then we can use that reserve to fund capital expenditure. None of that is internal borrowing. Internal borrowing, by definition, is any capital expenditure that is funded not by external funding, grants, capital receipts, or reserves. It's the other thing, which is almost like our cash. We always have some cash floating around, sometimes more than others. We've had quite a lot of it floating around recently because it looks like we're going to underspend in 23-4. We slipped on our capital program for 23-4, so we have cash in our accounts, quite a lot of cash. It's no bad thing when interest rates are relatively high because we can earn interest on it. But if you have cash floating around and you've got some capital expenditure that you can't fund any other way, you can use that cash. And that's like the equivalent of what I described buying the car and using a savings account. It's all our cash. It's just moving it from one place to another. The difference between internal borrowing and external borrowing is we don't pay interest to ourselves, but we do have to pay principal. We have to repay the debt internally, but there's no interest.
Right, thank you, Jim. Councillor Wootton.
Thank you, Chairman. Just following on from Councillor Marriott's point, first point, I'm just trying to understand, it's always nice and simplistic when we just look at a sum, and if we take it 789,000, but it's real money. So are we saying that over many years, and the source of the problem predates, I think, everyone in this room, but there is a loss of interest over that time, because that would be the natural conclusion, that if we're paying it back, it's an oversimplistic version of events, in the sense that we've not, there's an interest factor. I suppose that's the bottom line. So that's the first point. The second point I'll come back to, if I may, Chairman, in a moment, which is a different issue.
Yep. If we had been paying, it's not exactly a straight line, but 15,000 a year for 50 years, because the rules are that at the time, when we had a capital financing requirement of what turned out to be 789,000, you could have chosen to repay that through MRP over 50 years, which is, so you could say, well, the 298,000 is about 18 years of £15,000. It's not quite, because it's not even, because of the mistakes from the dating back to when the council had housing stock. But and we've got another 32 years of 15,000. Well, if we had set aside the 15,000 a year for the last 18 years, then we wouldn't have had that money available to earn interest on, because it would have acted as expenditure, it's real expenditure, and it would have affected our bottom line. But we've spent it effectively. We haven't invested it, we've spent it because we didn't know we had that commitment. So we've had the benefit of 15,000 a year for 18 years. And now we're paying the price for it. We're having to repay that 18 years of 15,000 at 298,000 all in one go. And we have to do that because 23/4 is the last set of accounts that were open at the time that I learned about this issue. So I'm obligated to put it into the earliest accounts I can, which is the 23/4. So we've had the benefit of it, of not providing for it. A bit like I haven't been replenishing my savings account for 18 years. And now the chickens are coming home to roost and I've got to put a big lump in to catch up. And that's the effect on the council's account. So we have benefits from it. And now we're having to pay it in one go. If we had started doing it, we still would have paid out 298,000. It's just that we didn't do it. So we're doing it all in one go.
Thank you, Chairman. And thank you, Mr. Willis, for that answer. And all of a sudden, you start feeling good about this because we've had the opportunity of spending it as opposed to it costing us interest. So it's lovely how an accountant can turn it around and make it seem like a positive. So, you know, you're actually making a case that we should run up debt of this type, internal borrowing, so that we can spend it to pay it back in 50 years' time. But that's a bit of a flippant comment, but it's a really helpful explanation on your part. But my second point, Chairman, is, look, £15,000 seems to be quite a sensible amount at the present time. But we know £15,000 today was worth £17,000 or £18,000 a matter of a year or two ago with inflationary costs. So I actually wonder, I would have thought there would be a desire, but you may tell me otherwise, I would have thought there'd be a desire to get this cleared as soon as possible. And it just seems quite a long while. And I would have thought it would be sensible to put a break clause in and sort of say, in 5 years' time, you know, sort of put some sort of inflationary proof element to get it paid back a bit faster, so it cleans up the books. But you may tell me that that's not sensible.
Some councils have a policy of having an escalating MRP policy. So our one, for not that we've had to worry about this in the past, but one that's been adopted for these purposes is just 2%, which is over 50 years. It's whatever the capital sum is divided, it's just 2%, but it's a flat 2%. Whereas other councils sometimes have a rising percentage. And what that is, one of the reasons they do that is it has the fortuitous benefit of having a smaller MRP charge in the early years and a larger one in the later years, but it better reflects inflation and the value of money over time. So that's feasible to do. It's a bit difficult to do with this because we're playing catch up and we shouldn't have done this the way we have done. And we may be criticised by the external auditor, even though we've done the right thing. So we could consider that. If we paid it off now, say the extreme interpretation is the balance of 491,000. I did actually contemplate this. What if we underspent by so much in 23/4 that we've got spare? we would just pay it all off. And that's what I could put in the report, and we won't have 15,000 a year for 32 years. Well, it equates to 3%. It'll be like a 3% investment return. If we paid it off and we saved and we didn't spend 15,000, it's about 3%. And it's maybe, don't know if it's worth it really. And especially as the value of money diminishes in future years, if it's always 15,000, then that 15,000 is only worth 10,000 in today's money in 20 years' time. So there is an argument for saying this is probably okay. Although it will be cleaner, just in a purist accounting sense, it would be cleaner to pay it all off and have it clear and have no CFR, because people always say, why have you got a CFR if you've got no external borrowing? And this explains it, but it doesn't make it easy to explain it.
Right. Councillor Mr. Wilson. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Willis, as well, because as a former chair of the Overview and Scrutiny Committee, this used to come up every year, and it was a number that was an article of faith that we just had to believe in. Just one thing, really, it's sort of counter to what Councillor Wotton said, because the value of money goes down over time. So 15,000, you're right, £15,000 5 years ago would have bought you a lot more, but in 30 years' time, it will probably be worth not very much. So swings and roundabouts.
Right, thank you, members. Well, the recommendation is that the committee notes the report. At least we've cleared it up at last. I never thought they'd ever find it. Okay, now. What? Oh, it cost us 15,000 to find out. Oh, okay, right. Anyway, agenda item 9 is about the appointment of the Constitution Working Group. We will now consider the report of the monitoring officer seeking to appoint a Constitution Working Group for 4 members, 1 from each political group. The report begins on page 9.1. Mr. Stickley, have you anything to add to the report?
I do, Chairman. Firstly, just to assure members a little of a question before the meeting about the role of this group, purpose of this group. So just to be clear, this group has no decision-making power, but what it is it's a forum for the political groups and officers on the council to discuss constitutional issues, prospective changes to the constitution, and it means that we keep the constitution under regular review, and it is a requirement of our new constitution in the terms of reference of this committee. The only other thing to add, Chairman, is that this paper was drafted before the groups have been approached about representation on this group. We do now have nominations from the 4 groups, so through you, Chairman, the committee might want to simply make the appointments directly tonight. And if I read what those are, from the Conservatives, Daniel Efty; Liberal Democrats, James Newport; Rochford District residents, Mrs. Vilma Wilson; and from the non-aligned group, Richard Lambourne. Other than that, Chairman, nothing further to add, but very happy to take any questions.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Stickley. Any members got any questions?
Just to note a typo on 8.1. Equality and health implications, just the incorrect spelling of there.
Well spotted.
Absolutely, and this is one of the few occasions where I can say it's not my report, not my typo, but I will certainly ensure that's passed on, Councillor Booth, and apologies, but credit for spotting it.
Right, thank you. Now, members, I have to move the recommendation set out on page 9.1 of the report for approval. Is there a seconder? Councillor Wotton. Okay. The recommendation is that the council appoints a Constitution Working Group of 4 members, 1 from each political group, and the votes by a show of hands. So all those in favour?
Could I just ask, Chairman, to be clear, that are you happy that the 4 names I've read are put forward, that they are those 4 members?
Members who all agree with that? Yes, we do. Thank you. That's unanimous. Thanks very much. Thank you. Right, well, that concludes the business for this evening. And thank you very much for the first meeting here. And I thank you for your contribution, actually, because it's showing direction. I like that. Thank you.